never knew when I bought my house when we were living in Papua New Guinea, I never knew that I was going to not only buy a house, but I was going to buy a community. I feel like with the house came my neighbors and their stories and the wonderful experiences that they were able to share with me. We made our home here beginning in 1981. I was the first of the neophytes, the learners. I couldn't hear enough about what had gone on before. And to the very present, I continue to be all ears when it comes to this special place that we are privileged to live in. I am going to share with you photographs which come from the book Kailua. I want you to know that if I don't touch on a subject that is of special interest to you, well, you will have opportunity to be able to ask about it, because it's just us here tonight, as though we are sitting on somebody's back lanai and we are talking story. And of course, we want to begin with some of the early scenes from Kailua. I wish I had something that would be able to take us back to 500 years ago. The oldest photograph that we have in the book is 1865, and that's on the cover of the book. It's from Monowili, and appropriately, that's where our ahupua'a actually began. But those of you who have been here some time, you remember that this was Coconut Grove, and you can see from the photograph how that the coconuts, thousands of them, were planted here. And it was the Waterhouse brothers who were trying to make their big place in life. And that was 1915, 1916, but they didn't succeed. And we have some ideas about why they didn't succeed, because they wanted to produce copra, which was a food from the coconut tree. But then we know that this scene is a day long gone in Kailua. But those who lived here before the war and after the war, the racetrack was shut down for a very short period of time during the war. But you may also know that this was part of the acreage that Harold Castle had devoted to the running of the ponies, as they called it. And there were watermelon patches here all over the place, and there were stables. And if you can lift it up from the bottom, that's okay. We get a sense of what it looked like. Thanks very much, Jim. But right in the middle of the racetrack on Kaha Street, just a few blocks away, is where the running of the ponies took place. And there were a faithful number of people, including those who were in the Navy. And they loved to be able to come over and see this little part of country life. If we can advance now, and I can take you to a little farther afield. You may not know that the Castles had as their big business interest, when they bought much of their property, it was for beef cattle. And so in Monowili, they had large acreages of beef cattle, and the Paniola were coming down, and eventually they would have those cows that were ready for market, and all of the beef was virtually going to Honolulu. But right over here just at the end of Duck Pond, is where they had an abattoir, and they had big corrals. And regularly they were bringing their cattle from Okapu back and forth for the summer and the winter. They were alternating. And here they are branding. And we know the names of some of these guys. We know that the Hedemans were very involved because Harold Castle's wife, Alice Hedeman, well, she had brothers. And all of them are gone now. But we have been able to learn some wonderful stories about that particular time. I just want you to fast forward because this story is a big one. I want you to be able to understand how that they advertised for the property. You see now the possibility for making millions of dollars from the beef cattle had finished, and right after the war, even before the war, it was possible during the 1950s to see the land with a future, and it was our own ahupua'a that was being offered for sale. For, in some cases, hundreds of dollars, you would have been able to purchase your lot. Or if you were a little bit more wealthy, you might be able to get something right along Kalaheo Avenue. And those lots were going very cheap for $1,000, some of them. And that's hard to believe these days as we have seen the rise, the inflation with all of our properties here. It was during the 1950s especially that changes were coming in a very broad way. You and I think right now with Target moving in and all of those apartment complexes going in there, change could not be more radical than what it is. Well, I just want you to get your mind around the thought that between 1950 and 1960, there was a threefold jump in the population. About 7,000 in 1950 in all of Kailua, and in 1960, it jumped to 26,000. Thanks largely to ads just like what you saw before. But in downtown Kailua, you could see, well, shops. The Kanatakis were right in the center of things. There was the theater, and the theater had its special weekly activities. And Harada Store was the big place right down there where Central Pacific Bank is now located. That was 1933. But you might wonder what was happening before this time. If you look towards the mountains there, you can see the place of origin. Monowili was the center of the stores to begin with. And Monowili had its own 6 stores. And I have interviewed people from this area who actually walked or rode their horses over to Monowili, especially to the Matsuda Store, to be able to do their grocery shopping. Sorry, Foodland, you were not the first one to be on the block. You can see the Kanataki Garage here. And it's fascinating to look at the images from that old time. We're getting a little more modern. You can see the canal as it's moving along. The Kainui Marsh is over in this area. We know that that was built, a small version of it. It was built in the 30s, about 1935. And then it was later widened, and it was made more accessible to some of the bigger craft that wanted to be able to use it. And now in the master plan for Kainui Marsh, they're thinking about the prospect, at least, of Kailua High being able to have a regular part of its curriculum, the sailing of canoes, and marrying them to this canal which still flows this way. Of course, the Hawaiians never had that opportunity. When they came sailing in, well, things were a whole lot different from what the opening of this bakery looked like. This was something very much later. But Jean's Bakery came into existence. It's right now being occupied by the Walgreens store. And that little corner and across the street where Hawaii, Hardware Hawaii now occupies the property, the Piggly Wiggly store was right in there. And you and I only have heard some of these exotic sounds from the past, titles which we didn't know about. If we hover over the top of Lanikai, if we go back far enough, it's not Lanikai at all, but it's Kauhau. And before the real estate agent changed the name, before they ever began to put the roads in that were paved, before the lots were sold, well, it looked like this. It's hard to believe, especially if you travel there on a weekend and you're bumper to bumper trying to even get out of there, to get around the corner where the rock house is located. Lanikai had its beginnings 1926. It was the same time virtually when the golf course was being built. Mid-Pacific Country Club was an opportunity for the wealthy in Honolulu to be able to get away for the weekend. And they began selling the lots simultaneous with that time. And Mr. Fraser was very successful as a real estate agent. Fascinating stories. The Hedemans lived in a little place about right in there. And Erling Hedeman Jr. was able to go out when he was a young man and catch lots of fish. And he would take them over to Chinatown for the most part. He would be able to make a very wonderful profit. You can see the landmark right here. Up on the hill is the Rock House, and Peggy Paulison Bradison still lives there. And I hope that you might someday have a chance to be able to visit that wonderful landmark for the Lanikai area. When the planes flew over in 1941, there was an aloha sign painted on the top of their roof. And all the pilots for our side were able to recognize that landmark. And Peggy remembers seeing one of those strange planes with a big red mark on it. And she wondered, could this possibly be the beginning of something else? She was very soon to recognize that on that day of infamy in 1941, a new chapter in our state's history was really coming to pass. We get these various scenes from the Lanikai area where the little cottages have been built. That's Peggy's mother, who is standing at the door. and they were able to build without changing the rock formations around. There were no big machines which came up here. They were aware of the fact that that was a sacred vahipana, a sacred site for the Hawaiians, and they were not going to touch it. They were going to accommodate their own housing needs right around it. And so you look in the book and you can see some other photographs associated with that area. And down on the beach, these little cottages, and I don't think there are any tourists that are coming around at that particular time. It wasn't on the map yet, but it didn't take very long for all of that to happen. And how it's happened. Buzz's Steakhouse, located right here. The casuarina pines that were the windbreak for all the coconut trees in this area. Many of them are still standing, and it's fascinating to see how the development has taken place. Of course, you all know where this is going. The water is going to Enchanted Lake. And it was Joe Powell in the 1950s who was able to bring that all to pass. Imagine, if you will, coming in as the Hawaiians did. Let's assume that that was 1,500 years ago, just for the sake of argument. And with their double-hulled canoes, they would be able to navigate this stream all the way over to the marsh. And once they had found the marsh, they knew that they were in paradise. Because in the marsh, the fish were there for the taking. I've interviewed people who are a little bit older than I am, and they were able to tell me how that their brothers especially caught 3-foot-long fish in Kainui Marsh. It's hard to imagine as we look at the green and the muck and the meadow, which is out there. But that was a paradise for the Hawaiians. And they used it primarily as their fish pond. And we don't know exactly where those fish ponds were located. We have an idea, based on some research, that the fish ponds were as many as 7 in Kainui Marsh. It's an acreage of about 850 total acres, and it was a wonderful opportunity. And from the marsh, they would be able to go to higher ground. You see the 3 peaks that are associated with our Ahupua'a. And you see the Poly Highway, which has gone in by this time. These peaks are Mount Olomana to begin with, and Nahiku and Panui. These were the promontories of our Ahupua'a. And I've been privileged to be able to hike all the way up into Monowili Valley, where I live, and follow the streams all the way down to their destination in the marsh. Today our concern is, how much water are they bringing? What about all these invasive plants? Have they taken over? We know that the marsh is not like it was before, but there are so many differences that have come. We have the opportunity to look at these old maps, to be able to see Oniava. We can see Konohiki. This is largely the area where we are right now. But it's been fascinating for me to look at these old maps which came out of the 1800s. And the cartographers from all over were coming in at the bidding of people who were wealthy like Harold Castle, because they wanted to be able to document, to have a paper trail for the land which they had bought. Here Chuck Burrows is standing talking to a group of students. If you're on the Kapa'akori Road and you know where the dip is, you know that on the Kainui side is where there is a lot of activity going on right now. That's Napohaku Ohawahine. And we are working there to try to get rid of the invasive trees, especially. The plants are pretty much eradicated thanks to the work of lots of volunteers. And if you ever want to pop in there, it's a safe place. There are big boulders just like this. In fact, what's interesting to me especially is that if you go to the base of these on the other side, you would be able to see the wave action of Kailua Beach. The erosion on that sandstone is so well marked there. You can see the wave action on the face of the rock. And what that tells us, of course, with lots of other evidence, is that Kailua has been in the process of change for a long time. Well, we're happy to get rid of some things like this. Some of you saw this, much to your dismay, before it was ever cleaned up. And now the wrecking crew has been able to pull it away, clean it up. Where that wrecking yard was located before is actually right on top of one of the rice mills. There were 5 rice mills originally in Kailua. One of the smaller ones was located just behind the banyan tree, right along the edge of the marsh. We're glad that this never went away. This is Pahlokini Hail, and I hope you might have sometime the opportunity to be able to go there. Within our ahupua'a, there were 10 heiau scattered in prominent places, all in association with water sites, just like Ulupo, just like A'ala at the Rock House in Lanikai. This is Pahlokini, which, as the name suggests, was the drum. We can only imagine what kinds of ceremonies were being done there. It's of the kind of heiau that the Hawaiians would have used for sacrificial offerings. It was during the time when there was lots of conflict and the struggles that were taking place between chiefs of various kinds. That's a whole chapter in its own. But we're glad that the heiau is located right here. And right along Kapa'akori Road, which goes on the other side of this barrier, is where there was another one. And that heiau is still preserved too. So right around the Kainui Marsh, you've got 3 important heiau. And the other 7 are scattered all around in other places within our Kailua. If you were to go today back on the road which leads to the stone quarry, and I encourage you to do that because the geology there is so interesting, you would be able to see where the digging has been done. And the gravel, it's not a mistake that when the volcano, the caldera for the volcano, which was Kawainui, when those fires were cooling down, the birth of all of this stone was taking place. You dig virtually everywhere in Kailua, with the exception of Coconut Grove. or with the exception of a few other places, and you're going to be hitting rock. Just like in Kailua town, there's lots of rock over there. But it soon fades off into sand, because where we are sitting this evening is where there was this big sandbar. If we could have come here 3,000 years ago, this place would have been virtually out of sight because we could have sailed right over the top. It would have been just like Kaneohe Bay, and we would have been able to smoothly glide over into Kauainui. But then, as the waters receded and changes were coming of various kinds, the Hawaiians never saw the water going over this area. It would have been covered by sand. But then eventually, as they made their way around, they were able to discover too, where's the sand and where's the rock and where's the fish, and well, they had a lot of discovering to take place. Today we have a population which is roughly 50,000 within the boundaries of our pie-shaped ahupua'a. And we know that one of the major contributors to that was this poly highway that began to be worked on in 1955. It was finally finished in 1960, virtually simultaneous with the coming of statehood. But when we look at the old maps, it's almost like a foreign language. I have spent many hours poring over these things, trying to figure out what are these locations, because it was only in the case of this map, this is 1899, and the surveyors were able to get the information from the Hawaiians who were still residing here, and they were able to put some of these names which we might be able to recognize, even though in many cases they have misspellings like Olohana. These Haole surveyors wouldn't have known the difference between Olomana and Olohana. But it's fascinating to see how they were able to make these markings. I could take you to any one of these because now we know where they are located. But as you travel down Kainalu, keep in mind you're coming along those streets that are intersecting there. And there are the 6 streams of Monowili, for example, located there. Palapu, Oma'o, Olomana. Those place names are there. If you were living here in the 1930s, you would have been able to go to Kailua Market. Girls, 1930, your mother wasn't born then. I wasn't born then. But these people were farming, and they had their produce stands. Talk about an open market. Man, they had them. And they were able to produce these wonderful foods. There were no less than 13 stands that the Japanese all were able to contribute to. I wanted to focus a little bit around the, I'll call it the Fertile Crescent, if you will, because we have been able to find some wonderful things. This is the biggest, this is one of the rice mills, Yimquan, right behind where the Castle Medical Center is located now. But look here, we've got a tailor shop, a barber shop, a cemetery, a blacksmith shop, and the biggest of these rice mills was right here, Wang Leong. That's a chapter all in its own. When I worked on that, I went to City Mill because I knew that there were relatives of Wong Leong who were related to CKIE. To make a long story short, City Mill has its origins in rice milling in Monowili. So the next time you shop there, you might bring a smile to the clerk's face if you say, "Where is your mill located?" And she might think, "Oh, that must be timber, lumber." It had nothing to do with timber at that time. It was all rice milling. And if you come on one of my tours, I'll take you to places just like this. Down behind the Castle Medical Center, the Matsuda Store came into existence 1924. Went out of existence, as you might guess, when the Poly Highway came in. So in 1960, this was POW. And I have been fortunate to be able to interview some of these family members who now have passed away. How would you kids like to skinny dip in this? This is a stream right here. This is Monowili Stream. And when I've interviewed the kids from the farming families in Monowili, they have told me that one of the big highlights of their life was after working in their fields with their parents, they would be able to come and cool off down at a live pond. And we have a large photograph of that in the book. It was a very favorite spot of theirs. They would dam it up. They would make sure that there was a big enough body of water, and they'd be able to enjoy the water that was there. This is a map which shows you how the water would be able to go down the stream and eventually would be able to find its way out into Kainui Marsh. My home is located about right here, Monowili Estates. That was built up at the same time virtually as Monowili Park. And that was almost simultaneous with 1960, the coming in of the highway. And we know that back here, the state owns 2,000 acres and it's all zoned watershed. And I look at those springs that are still flowing there, and I am so happy that the state owns it. The biggest landowner up there, of course, is the Weinberg Foundation, because they got the golf course, Luana Hills, today Royal Hawaiian Country Club. They were able to get that property, which was 1,059 acres, that was purchased in 1984. Think of it, 1,059 acres for the bargain basement price of $3.4 million. And I went to the legislature and I tried to convince, we tried to convince our legislators, this is a steal, it was wonderful. Well, who bought it? A rich tycoon from Japan. And he did, among other things, right away change the name of Monowili to Waiwai Valley. Yasuo Yasuda. And that was his valley. And he only owned it for a short time because he couldn't pay all the bills for the golf course. And they've only built one 18-hole golf course in there. But they still have the land which they would like to cut up and sell, I suppose, as gentleman farms. the oldest picture in all of the book. You see the people working in their gardens. 1865, you see some hollow trees, kukui nut, but very little else. If you come into Monowili now, we would unfortunately greet you with all these albesias. We've got them everywhere, and it's a scourge we're going to have to take care of. I don't know how it's going to happen, but it's still on the list of things to be done. I could take you on one of my tours and you could look at these beautiful facings along the banks. They're still there. The springs are still flowing, and all along are the terraces that the Hawaiians left as artifacts almost for us, because that's all we can do with them now. But they're there. And the water from the upper portions of Monowili is still flowing into Waimanalo. Because what has happened primarily is that some of the wealthy landowners were able to divert the flow of water. Like William G Irwin in 1893, he purchased the Hedeman estate. And his primary purpose in purchasing those 600 acres was to be able to get the water for his thirsty crop, which was located over in Waimanalo. And the sugar plantation was located there. And the water is still churning its way over there. Just within the last 2 years, the Department of Agriculture has improved this system for getting the water over there, and they have invested about another $8 million in just recent days. Why is that? Well, the little farms in Waimanalo are crying for more water. More and more of these very important crops for us are in need of this precious resource. And it's the first time in Hawaii state's history that water from one area, one ahupua'a, was being able to go to a different ahupua'a. It's a classic case in water rights. And I am not here tonight to say that never should have been done. I am here to say it was done. And we need to think about that, because we don't have the hydrology studies to be able to tell us even how much water is going into Waimanalo, or how much is coming into Kawainui. This is the home of William G Erwin, 1893. The case went to the Supreme Court because down in lower Monowili, the rice farmers took him to task and said, "You're stealing our water." And he said, "I have every right to do that because I bought the land." 1893, 1894, 1895, the decision came down. And some of you know that there was the overthrow at that same time. The Queen was incarcerated in the palace. And there was a new federal government. There was a new judiciary. And the Supreme Court took the side of, you know who, the one with the wealthy pockets. And I have read through all of that testimony, some of it in Hawaiian, some of it in Chinese. I've read the English versions to be able to get a good understanding of how that battle was taking place. And William G Erwin, who could get on his horse and go across to Waimanalo. He could be in his office in 15 minutes, following the old government road, which is still there. If I took you on the tour, you would be able to see the carriageway. This is where the royal family would come. The Queen's Bath is located right here. The Boyd family had this house. The Koki family had this house. These people who were living there in the last 50 years were only caretakers for the property. But what a wonderful coming together of Kailua, if you will, was taking place up there. Yes?
Does the state have any plans to like fix those houses up? Because they're pretty sad shape up there.
At this point in time, the state cannot fix those houses up. It's got to be an agreement, but we are working hard with the landowner, which is Weinberg Foundation. And we are trying to convince them that in all of our ahupua'a, there is not a more treasured historic place. It's the single most valuable place in all of Kailua. It would be about 10 acres up here. And we are coming closer because now there is Mr. Kalama, Corbett Kalama, who is on the board of the Weinberg Foundation. And Corbett, with his reputation and his Hawaiian ties, is being able to make some pretty persuasive arguments. The Kailua Historical Society has said we could turn this into a fabulous educational center. To me, the most valuable part is not the Howley House here, which was 1893. That's valuable, yes, and there's nothing that equals it in all of our windward side. To me, the most valuable part of all of this property up there are the Loi and the Awai, these terraces which still exist where the Hawaiian families were living and working and producing. And so they could easily walk from their homes, we think, along the marsh, and they would be able to get up to their garden in just a matter of an hour or so and bring down all of this wonderful kalo. That's part of the story. This is also sadly part of the story. And the Royal Hawaiian Country Club says, we don't have money to be able to mow the lawn. And we have said, we'll mow the lawn for you. Whenever I take a tour up there, I get permission from them. And I hope in the future you might be able to come and actually see this. There have been all kinds of activities in here over the last 12 years when nobody has lived there, including drug dealing. We have this photograph from the 1930s. One of the friends of the Queen had come back to the area, and she was able to reminisce and to reflect. I don't know, was she humming maybe the tune of the Liuokalani, who was inspired when she had been there back in the 1880s to write Aloha Oi? I'm not sure. But we do know that the changes have just taken place all around us. And there will be more changes, just like the Castle Medical Center coming here. Harold Castle was the philanthropic individual who gave these 10 acres to Kainalu School with the proviso, use my middle name. That was his single proviso for this school, but he gave it. Likewise, the Castle Medical Center was his legacy as well. Just give it my name. And what a gift it has been to all of us over these years since 1964. With the churches, you might be interested. We have Church Row, and we have, I believe it's 8 churches along there. He did not give the land to the churches, but he gave it to them at a wonderful reduced rate. And you can count them as you go by. It's interesting to me that the Nazarene Church, located over here on Aniava, refused to move. Harold Castle said, "I'll give you a spot right along Church Row." And the Nazarenes said, "We don't want to move. We want to stay right where we are." Because their church was primarily made up of Japanese farmers from this area. Interesting little sidelight to history.
Well, you need to explain that Harold Castle's middle name is Kainalu.
What?
The middle name was Kainalu.
The Paliku is located right here. We understand where this is. As you come out of the polytunnel, you make a right-hand turn and you go down to what was the first of the Castle family mansions on the windward side. That was built in 1926. And then they sold it to the Catholic Church after the war had finished. So by 46, 47, the Catholic activities were being able to be taking place right here. But where did they move to? Well, it's off the map right up here. And if you know where our president has stayed, and that you all do, you know that that's the location over there. Occasionally now, Chris Castle comes back, the son of Harold Kainalu Castle. And I believe that there are lots of thoughts in his mind. When he was given a copy of our book, it was greatly satisfying to him, and he appreciated what we had done. But I reminded him of the fact that his father's name, the middle name, Kainalu, not only means ocean wave, but it also can mean to reflect, to ponder, to wonder. And I know that with Chris Castle, as he has moved through different stages of his life, he has also given quite a bit of thought to reflection. So tonight, I ask you also to reflect and to remember. We've lost a lot in the process. The Mohoy family, this is Saul Jr., they have given us their stories. And I don't know what you might take as an image away from this evening, but I hope there is one or another of these images which impresses you a great deal, or gives you thought, or stimulates your thinking about the future where we all would like to go. I thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for letting me share this with you. In the future, I think that the Kailua Historical Society will be back to this area, because there's really one story that we would like to tell more in detail, just like Peter reminded me this evening. He said, are you ever going to tell the story about the airplane crashing here on the property of this school? This was after the war had finished. And I think that in the future, the Kailua Historical Society would like to be able to come back and do this, especially for your community, because these things are gone unless we look in the rearview mirror and we have the ability to be able to gather the story and to still make it live for the children. Thank you very much.